Morning, everyone. My name is Doug Ferguson. I'm a senior programming analyst here at CMAP. I'm also the project manager for the call for projects that I believe that's what you're here for today. Just before we get going, a couple of things. As we're going through our presentation, I'm joined here today with my co-workers, John Hadsma and Sarah Stolpe. Feel free to use the chat function to put questions into the chat, and we'll pause periodically through and try to answer some of the questions as we're going. We've also allotted some time at the end of the presentation to cover questions as well. And at that point in time, we'll ask if anybody wants to ask verbal questions at that point in time. Just make sure that you're muted so that we don't have any interference as we're going. So with that, I'm going to kick things off. Of course. So the transportation call for projects, and we're going to highlight this several times. Next slide is the URLs for the call for projects website. This URL is going to be like your point where you can find all the materials for the call for projects, as long as this is where we're going to post things like all the applications that have been submitted come January. And we just lost hold on one second and we'll get the PowerPoint back up.
My internet is having an issue.
There we go. So this is the URL for the call for projects, the full one, and then a short URL. But this is where we'll post the results of our evaluation of projects, the proposed program that'll go to the project selection committees. So this is where you should go and look for materials first and foremost before reaching out to staff. But then if you can't find anything, please do reach out to us. Next slide. So as the MPO for Northeastern Illinois, CMAP is responsible for allocating certain federal funds directly to local transportation projects. CMAP solicits applications from local governments, highway and transit agencies for all phases of the highway transit, for all phases of projects, including highway transit, bike ped maintenance, modernization, and expansion projects. And applies scoring methodologies developed by our project selection committee to the recommended program of projects for funding. The scoring methodologies and program development are largely driven by federal requirements and the three principles of ON2 2050, which are inclusive growth, resilience, and prioritized investment. We program for 5 years at a time and cannot program more in 1 year than is reasonably expected to be available in that year. Project applications are solicited through this call for projects, which is held every 2 years. And the goal of each call is to program the final 2 years of the 5-year programs and to fill in projects in earlier years where funds may be available due to project delays or updated estimates of available funds. This year's call for projects involves, this year's call for project involves 4 federal funding programs. They are the Surface Transportation or STP-Shared Fund, the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Program, known as CMAQ, the Carbon Reduction Program that was introduced with the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and the Locally Programmed Transportation Alternatives Program, or TAPL. So I'm going to now pass it over to my colleague, John, who's going to talk about the STP-Shared Fund.
Good morning, all. As Doug said, my name is John Hadsma. I'm a program analyst with the programming team here at CMAP. I'm going to be speaking to you about the STP-Shared Fund and some of the general requirements and eligibility. So If we move on to the next slide here, the purpose of the shared fund and the reason why it was established is to fund regional scale projects that can make large and lasting contributions. And the program cuts across a wide spectrum of eligible project types. So that includes road reconstructions or expansions, transit station, yard, or terminal improvements, bus speed improvements, corridor or small area safety projects, truck route improvements, rail highway grade crossing improvements, and that includes separations, and the elimination of barriers such as roads, railroads, and bodies of water to bicyclists and pedestrians. So there are 4 main evaluation criteria sections that shared fund projects are evaluated for, which are project readiness, transportation impact, planning factors, and sub-regional priorities, all of which we're going to go into detail on later in the presentation. On the next slide, there are 2 primary requirements that must be met to be eligible for the shared fund. The first is that projects must have a total cost, and this is for all phases from preliminary engineering through construction of at least $5 million. The caveat to that is that lower cost projects are eligible if they're regional in nature, and that's by having a partnership between 3 or more agencies, including at least 1 municipality. And a partnership here means that all partners are participating financially in the project, so not just providing letters of support. And then the second requirement is that all shared fund projects must be included in an adopted local or regional plan. This can be a municipal comprehensive plan, a sub-regional bicycle and pedestrian plan, or a local or regional freight or truck routing plan. There's additional guidance and other examples of acceptable local plans and contact to CMAP planning staff that can answer questions about the plan if your plan qualifies. So for existing projects that are currently included in the Shared Fund active program that want to request a project change, whether you need to submit a new application or not will depend on the type of change you are requesting. So for schedule changes, a new application is not required. Rather, a schedule request form should be submitted for any phases programmed in 2025 or later. However, for cost changes, sponsors should submit a new application, treating the currently programmed funds as committed and requesting any additional funds that are needed. And then if it's not selected for additional funding, nothing about the project's current status will change. But if it is selected for additional funding for an already programmed phase, the program funds may be moved to a different year. And for projects currently on the contingency list or phases programmed in federal fiscal year 2025 that are at risk of not meeting an obligation deadline, those should also reapply as if they were a new project. And finally, for projects partially funded in other programs, so that could be such as CMAQ, HSIP, or TAP, may submit a new application to fill any funding gaps that exist. However, shared fund applications should not be submitted to replace those other committed funds. So I'm going to pass it back to Doug to talk to you all about some of the CMAQ eligibility requirements.
Great, thanks, John. So the CMAQ program has been around since 1992. CMAQ funds come to Northeastern Illinois region because as a region, we don't meet federal air quality standards for ozone. Next slide. Therefore, the program is focused on reducing ozone precursor emissions from transportation mobile sources. The program in Northeastern Illinois receives approximately $120 million each year. Slide. The types of projects that can be funded with CMAQ fit into these 5 categories. Projects like intersection improvements, signal interconnects, and bottleneck eliminations are under the traffic flow improvement category. Transit service and capital improvement projects, including operating funds for new service, fit under the transit service and capital category. Projects that directly reduce emissions through measures such as retrofitting existing diesel engines, repowering vehicles with cleaner engines, or replacing vehicles with alternative fuel vehicles are the direct emissions reduction projects. Bicycle facility projects that can lead to shifting people out of cars fit under the bicycle facilities category. And finally, we have our other projects that result in emissions reduction or demonstration projects that don't fit nicely under one of these other four categories. I will say, if you are considering a demo project, please reach out to me first, as there's several unique federal requirements that are tied in with that project category. Next slide. There are a few project types that are not eligible for CMAQ funding, including projects that had single occupancy vehicle throughput lanes, operating expenses for existing transit service, and projects that are considered routine maintenance, including reconstruction of roads, bridges, and stations, and in-kind replacement of track or other equipment. Similar to the CMAQ program, the Carbon Reduction Funds, or CRP, were created by the IIJA in 2021, and a portion of Illinois' funds are being suballocated to Northeastern Illinois. The project types and overall goal of CRP are nearly identical to the CMAQ program. Because of this, all applications submitted for CMAQ consideration will also be evaluated for CRP funding. The one major difference is that CRP is focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which will be used in the evaluation of applications. But all other measures and criteria will remain the same as CMAQ. And now, turning it over to Sarah, who's going to talk a little bit about the TAP program.
Good morning, Sarah Stolpe, Program Analyst here at CMAP, here to talk about TAP-L, the final fund source available in this call for projects, the Transportation Alternatives Program. The TAP program is focused on implementing ON to 2050's recommendation to complete the regional greenways and trails plan by programming approximately $20 million per year for bicycle facilities. As with CMAQ bicycle facilities, these projects need to be transportation oriented and not solely focused on recreational use. And we'll get into the requirements for all projects here. These are the common requirements for all three federal programs. Generally speaking, the project sponsor is an agency that will enter into financial agreements with IDOT or will be the FTA grant recipient and therefore must be a unit of government that can levy taxes. This includes state agencies, municipalities, counties, townships, park and forest preserve districts, and transit agencies. Within the STP-Shared Fund only, non-municipal sponsors are strongly encouraged to partner with a municipality directly impacted by the proposed project. Within the TAP program only, IDOT is not an eligible sponsor, but is welcome to partner with eligible sponsors. Private entities and nonprofits cannot sponsor projects directly, but are encouraged to partner with eligible sponsors. And finally, when partnering with others on projects, one eligible sponsor will take on the lead and should be there on and should create intergovernmental agreements between each partner and sponsor for financial participation. In order to receive any of these federal funds, the sponsor must provide a minimum of 20% of the cost of each individual phase from a non-federal source. Each phase must be matched individually, so providing 100% local funding for phase one engineering, for example, does not reduce the amount that is needed for a match in future phases. Examples of non-federal fund sources include the motor fuel tax, Rebuild Illinois funds, Illinois bond funds, state funds, local and regional programs like Invest in Cook, and even private funds. Understanding the burden that providing a match can place on the region's highest needed communities, the use of transportation development credits, commonly known as toll credits, is permitted in lieu of the local match if requested at the time of application. While talking about funding requirements, I also want to remind everyone that these are reimbursement programs. No funding is provided up front for engineering phases and for construction phases that are let locally. the project sponsor must pay all costs and seek reimbursement through FHWA, through IDOT, or FTA. For construction projects that are led by IDOT, IDOT will make the payments to the construction contractor and bill the sponsor for their share. Across all programs, phase 1 or preliminary engineering is not eligible for funding, except in the case of the region's highest need communities that are identified as cohort 4 in CMAP's FY24 community cohorts document. These communities are listed in the program application booklets. In addition to being ineligible for funding, preliminary engineering must be underway prior to December 20th, the application deadline for this call, in order to apply for any funding. The degree of completion of preliminary engineering will determine what phases are eligible for consideration and will establish the maximum cost increases that can be considered for those phases in the future. This is a change to prior policy, which required preliminary engineering to be substantially complete in order to apply for funding. Because signal interconnect projects eligible for CMAQ do not typically have a traditional phase 1 engineering process, these projects are ineligible for phase 2 engineering. The further along preliminary engineering is, the more phases are eligible for funding, and those phases will be eligible for larger future cost increases if needed. As long as preliminary engineering is underway as defined in the application booklets, construction and construction engineering are eligible for funding. If preliminary engineering is complete, all remaining phases of the project are eligible for funding and may receive cost increases if needed in the future, up to 100% of the program funds. The degrees of completion for phase 1 engineering are defined as shown here and vary based on whether the project will be processed through IDOT, which is typical for road, bridge, and bike ped projects, or through the Federal Transit Administration, which is typically transit projects sponsored by the service boards or the City of Chicago. These degrees are linked to the NEPA processing for projects and are described in much more detail in the application booklets. Verification of the completion status will require applicants to attach certain documents, such as a design approval letter, meeting minutes, or correspondence that document the milestones that have been met.
All right, so we are going to now dig into how projects are evaluated, and starting again with the shared fund. So the chart included on this slide is the overall scoring matrix for the shared fund. And as I mentioned earlier, the 4 main categories are project readiness, transportation impact, planning factors, and sub-regional priority. Each of those has subcategories, which we'll step through in the coming slides, and all projects can receive up to 100 total points, with the highest scoring projects being given first consideration for available funding. So project readiness is worth 15% of the total score, and that includes up to 10 points for completing phase 2 design engineering milestones and right-of-way acquisition, and up to 5 points for leveraging other available fund sources, such as local STP, CMAQ, Invest and Cook, state funds, local funds, or even private funds, just to reduce the STP share of the project cost. Next criteria is the transportation impact scoring, and this is 50% of the total score, and it varies by project type and is divided into 3 subcategories. There is first the existing condition or need, improvement, and job and household impacts. In general, the existing condition scores are scaled within each project type based on the current condition that is germane to that specific project type. Improvement scores compare a project's potential to improve conditions relative to the total cost of the improvements. And then getting into that jobs and household piece, this accounts for 10 points in the transportation impact scoring. And this is a criterion which was modified for this cycle, and we'll discuss on the next slide here shortly. And since this is a competitive program that is designed to address very specific needs, and any project with a raw improvement score of 0 will not be considered for funding or inclusion in the contingency program. And projects must also demonstrate need in order to be eligible as well. So for example, bicycle and pedestrian barrier elimination projects will not be considered if no physical barrier exists. Bridge projects will not be considered if their sufficiency rating is higher than 80, and transit station improvements wouldn't be considered if their average term score is considered good or excellent. And again, the thresholds for each project type are described in detail within the application booklet. The number of jobs and households that can potentially benefit from the project is determined by using the regional travel model to generate the travel shed of the places that people come from and go to using the facility being improved. So in past application cycles, all of the jobs and households within a project's travel shed were added together. The sum was then compared to all other project applications and scaled to 10 points. But recognizing that the proportion of households served by a transportation facility can be higher, even when the raw number of households is small. And that's particularly in less densely populated areas of the region. The methodology now splits jobs and households into two separate components, and each of those is worth 5 points. The methodology for jobs remains unchanged. So all the jobs within the travel shed are added together and scaled to 5 points relative to all of their projects. And for households, a project area is now defined by extending a radius from the center of the project to the center of the furthest analysis zone in the travel shed and creating a project area based on this radius. The number of households within that travel shed are then compared to the households in the project area, and the ratios are then compared to all other projects and scaled to 5 points. And finally, once that's done, the 2 point values are added together to reach that maximum of 10 points for the jobs plus households impact. All right, so this table here on this slide summarizes the factors considered for each project type to define existing conditions and determine the relative need for the project. As you can see, the factors are generally tied to performance measures like mobility, reliability, safety, and condition of the bridge or the pavement or the transit facility. And you can get more detailed explanation here in the application booklet. And likewise, the improvements considered for each project type are shown in this table on the slide. Within each project type, the cost effectiveness of the improvements are scaled relative to each other. And again, detailed definitions and scoring breakdowns for both the need and improvements are included in the application booklet. So moving on to planning factors, this makes up 30% of the total shared fund score. And they evaluate the extent to which the project or sponsor supports a number of regional planning priorities, including inclusive growth, complete streets, multimodal freight movement, transit supportive density, and resilience. And resilience was new in the last cycle and has been updated for this current cycle. The factors and the maximum points for each varies by project type, but each project type can receive up to a maximum of 30 points from planning factors. So for example, you can see at the top that bicycle and pedestrian projects are scored based off of inclusive growth, complete streets, and resilience to reach that 30 points for that project type. So stepping through each of these quickly, first with inclusive growth, this planning factor awards points to projects based on the percent of users of the facility that are people of color below the poverty line. The points are predetermined based on the data that is shown on the map here. If we move to the complete streets one on the next slide, this planning factor awards points if the jurisdiction where the project is located has a policy or ordinance supporting complete streets. And points are also awarded if the scope of the project includes complete street elements such as sidewalks, bike lanes, multi-use paths, refuge islands, curb extensions, or pedestrian countdown signals, just to name a few. The next one, resilience. And again, this was added as a new planning factor last cycle. replacing the green infrastructure factor. And like complete streets, there is both a policy and an elements part of the score. And new this cycle, there's a need portion of the score based on the project location. So projects are eligible to receive policy points if the local jurisdiction has an adopted policy with the goal of increasing transportation resilience. And a green streets policy is one example of a resilience policy. Projects will also receive additional points for including elements in the scope that improve the ability of the transportation asset. So that includes the road, the bike path, the station, just to name a few, to withstand one or more elements of a weather event or natural disaster, or to increase the resilience of the infrastructure from the impacts of changing conditions, such as flooding or extreme heat. Eligible elements include green infrastructure, flood control, and intelligent transportation systems such as weather responsive traffic management, and additionally gray infrastructure for stormwater storage, compensatory storage, drainage structure upgrades, and roadway relocation or evaluation above flood level, or are considered eligible elements if they exceed established design standards. The number of element points is greater where the exposure to climate vulnerability is greater. So if we move on into freight movement, points for the freight planning factor are awarded to projects located on the National Highway Freight Network, a designated Class 1 or 2 truck route, or a NHS intermodal freight connector. Additional points are also awarded if the sponsor or local jurisdiction has freight supportive policies, or if the sponsor completed freight related studies, or if the project is included in a freight mobility plan. And finally, the transit planning factor awards points for the projects located in areas where higher densities are allowed, innovative parking requirements exist, or mixed use zoning exists. And the last scoring criteria here is the subregional priority. So while the bulk of the scoring methodology that I've discussed so far addresses regional priorities, because our region is so large, it's important to also recognize that the 12 subregions, each council mayor's area in the city of Chicago, they also have their own unique priorities. And to recognize that, each council and the city have an opportunity to identify their 5 highest priority projects from all eligible applications submitted for the shared fund. Those priorities are worth up to 5% of the total score and will receive the points shown on the table. And although it is anticipated that the councils and CDOT will identify projects located within their borders, regardless of the sponsor agency, as their highest priorities, they may also identify priorities outside of their borders when there is a clear justification of the transportation benefit to their residents and to persons working or traveling within their subregion. So projects that are designated as priorities by more than one subregion will receive the combined points up to a maximum of 5. So with that concludes the scoring of the shared fund, and now we're going to get into the scoring of the CMAQ and CRP, and I'm going to pass it back to Doug.
Thanks, John. So moving on here, the CMAQ CRP programs have 3 screening criteria. The transportation projects must have a demonstrated air quality benefit as estimated by CMAP staff. All bicycle facility projects must be found in an adopted or approved plan, and the projects must have realistic development schedules. Projects that don't meet these screening criteria will not be funded. Projects are scored on a 100-point scale, with the majority of points coming from the air quality cost effectiveness. 30 points are available from transportation impact criteria specific to the project type, and 20 points are available from the equity scoring. The air quality cost effectiveness is calculated by using the estimated emissions reduction. If I could just ask everybody to remember to remute your mic. All project types. I'm just going to pause here for a second.
Whatever. Whatever. I don't know. All right. Sorry about that. I pushed that.
All right. I think I got the. All right, so let's start over again here. The air quality cost effectiveness is calculated by using the estimated emissions reduction and the total project cost. All project types except the direct emissions reduction projects are based upon volatile organic compound or VOC emissions reduction. The direct emission reduction projects are evaluated on a combination of particulate matter and nitrogen oxide emissions. For the CRP funds, greenhouse gas emissions will be used for all the applications. For the project costs, all costs associated with all phases of the project should be provided, even those phases that are already completed or funding received outside of the CMAQ or CRP programs, with one exception. If a project is being completed as part of a larger project, the total project cost may be only for the CMAQ or CRP funded project if the project has independent utility, meaning it could be completed on its own and would be a standalone project. For example, bicycle side path project that is being completed as part of a larger road project, only the costs associated with the bicycle facility are considered because the side path has independent utility from the road improvements. The cost effectiveness is reported as dollars per kilogram of these particular emissions eliminated. The transportation criteria scoring is different based upon the project type as summarized here. I'll go over each individually on the next few slides. For highway projects, travel time reliability is worth 15 points. It is measured based upon the planning time index for the project roadway and the qualitative characteristics of the proposed improvements, such as inclusion of certain ITS solutions or elements that will improve incident detection, response, and recovery that are listed along with the point values in the application booklet. The safety score is calculated using IDOT's Safety Road Index for roadway segments and intersections. And lastly, if the project is part of a corridor improvement or if the project design and scope includes a transit improvement like transit signal priority, queue jumps, dedicated bus lanes, fixed station or stop improvements, or pedestrian access to transit, corridor transit improvement points will be awarded. For transit projects, ridership increase is the overall increase in transit ridership resulting from the project. Travel time reliability used for the transit service projects is composed of a quantitative measure of on-time performance on a particular route with the qualitative evaluation of the project's impact on reliability, which is described in detail in the application booklet. Existing asset condition used only for transit capital projects is based on the condition of the asset being improved, and this is uses the score from RTA's asset inventory. Finally, points are awarded for transit supportive land use based upon the permitted density, the use of innovative parking requirements, and the presence of mixed-use zoning around the project. Bicycle projects are scored on 3 factors. Safety and attractiveness compares the condition after the improvement to the before condition. The larger difference in the condition, the higher the score. The connectivity measure considers the connection to other bikeways or level of traffic stress on connecting roadways. The highest of the 2 scores is retained between those 2 different areas. Finally, because measuring transit availability helps ensure that bicycle facility bicycle facilities provide a realistic alternative to auto use by evaluating the potential to link bicycling with transit for longer trips. Projects receive higher points for higher transit availability, which is an onto 2050 indicator. Direct emissions reduction projects receive 5 points if they are improving public fleets, and the benefit to sensitive populations is scored based upon an index that looks at particulate concentrations in relationship to population in a census tract that are either over the age of 65, under the age of 5, or minority or low income. The last element of CMAQ and CRP scoring is a modification of the last cycle's equity scoring. The inclusive growth is the same in the CMAQ and the STP program, awarding points to projects based upon percentage of users of the facility that are people of color below the poverty line, and is calculated for both roadway and transit line users. The disadvantaged community measure has been modified to use USDOT's Equitable Transportation Community Tool, or ETC. This is a two-part scoring system. First, applicants will use the tool and its social vulnerability information to identify the disadvantaged population groups who are located within or adjacent to the project area's census tract. People with low income, older adults, people with disabilities, youth, and people with limited English proficiency are the different vulnerable populations. Specifically, project applicants should identify any groups that exceed the 65th percentile according to the ETC tool. Then applicants will need to describe how the project will provide benefits to these groups. Up to 4 points is available in this section. The applicant will use the tool again to identify the burdens related to the transportation system or the services in the location that would be served by the project, and describe how the project will address these burdens. Up to 6 points is available for this section. For more information, please reference the application booklet and USDOT's ETC tool website. Now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who's going to talk about TAP evaluation.
Thank you, Doug. Our last program, again, is our locally programmed TAP. To receive TAP funding, the project must be a bicycle facility that is transportation related and not solely recreational. This is included in an adopted or approved plan and has a realistic development schedule. Projects are scored on a 100-point scale, with 30 points coming from how the project helps complete the regional greenways and trails plan, 20 points from the population and employment density of the area around the bicycle facility, and finally 20 points from the safety and attractiveness rating, which, like the CMAQ bicycle projects, compares the after improvement condition to the before condition. 20 points are awarded for equity, like CMAQ and CRP, and the final 10 points are from project readiness, which, with points awarded in right-of-way, has already been, with points awarded if right-of-way has already been acquired, or is not needed, or if phase 2 engineering is already complete. So continuing on here, we'll talk a little bit more about the application process and timeline for all of these fund programs. Applications are submitted through CMAP's online ETIP database. ETIP gathers basic project information and requested funding information and provides a tool for mapping the project location, provides a file uploader for attaching all documents related to the project application, a comprehensive ETIP user guide and pre-recorded training session for completing applications through ETIP is available on the Call for Projects website. In addition to the ETIP application, several attachments are also required, including the application workbook, which is an Excel file that asks in-depth technical questions specific to each fund source and project type, as well as a detailed cost estimate, a status update form, which details project schedule and will be updated by sponsors quarterly going forward, and other forms are required based on project type. All of the forms are available for download download again on the Call for Projects webpage. Completed forms should remain in their original file format, typically Excel or Word, and should not be converted into other file types like PDF. Here's the general timeline for the Call for Projects. All applications are due by the close of business on December 20th. Local project sponsors are strongly encouraged to save their applications as final within the ETIP database by December 9th. These applications completed by the state will be reviewed by the region's planning liaisons for completeness and potential errors before final submittal to CMAP. Local sponsors can then coordinate with their planning liaison to make changes and add or update attachments prior to the final December 20th deadline. From January to March, CMAP staff will complete project evaluation and scoring and will present a staff recommended program to the respective project selection committee in April. The public comment period for the staff recommended programs will take place in April and May for 30 days. The exact date is still being determined. Staff will review the public comments and make any necessary updates to the recommendations and present the final programs to the project selection committees for consideration in May. Once approved by the committees, tip changes will be made for the CMAP Transportation Committee consideration, and final approval of the program will occur by the MPO Policy Committee of those tip changes at their June meeting. The best place to find information that you need to submit and complete the application is the Call for Projects webpage, highlighting that URL again, cmap.is/2024 Call for Projects. All application materials and forms and FAQs can be found on this page. A recording of how to apply within the ETIP database is included, and a recording of this webinar will be added in the next couple of days. Local agencies should also reach out to their planning liaison. Not only are the PLs experts in these programs and the ETIP database, but they also know more about your local projects and will be reviewing their applications prior to CMAQ. Thank you all so much, and we'll open it to questions here.
Thanks, Sarah. I don't see any questions in the chat function, but if participants want to ask a verbal question, just ask you that you use the raise hand function, and staff will call on you here, just so that we can avoid folks talking over. So we got a question in the chat. It is, in what federal fiscal year will funding become available in reality? As I mentioned at the beginning, we are really programming the last 2 years of the 5-year cycle. So 2029 and 2030 is where the majority of the funding is. That being said, in each of the different programs, there is small amounts of funding that are available in the preceding years, so 26, 27, and 28. So that's going to be dependent on what's being asked for, what's available. Oftentimes other projects that are already in these programs get delayed and we need to backfill into those. But the majority of funding is in the 2029 and 2030 timeframes. So we've got some more questions in the chat. It was mentioned that all applicants through the CMAQ program will also be included for the CRP program. Is the reverse true, or is the same application for both programs? So it's the same application. So when you go into ETIP, if you select either CMAQ or CRP in the major implementation group, you'll be considered for both. So it doesn't matter. It's true for both. Next question, regarding the regional travel model, travel shed, does everyone have access to these data sources? Unfortunately, no. So the regional travel model and travel shed, that is something that CMAP does. It's just not something that we can share. So no. Let's see, taking another question. Are there any other alternatives to satisfying the requirements to having a proposed project included in an adoptive plan? No. So there are a lot of different plan types that we will accept, but no, if the project application, so for STP Shared Fund or bicycle facility projects on CMAQ, CRP, and TAP, they are required to be in an adopted plan. Now, the adopted plan can be in regional in scope, it can be sub-regional in scope, and then it also can be local. So all we're looking for is that something that talked about the effort to plan for that type of facility prior to the implementation of the project. Let's see, where are we here? There was a question about the date for phase one was being suggested to be started or completed. So phase one needs to be started prior to the application deadline of December 20th. That being said, as Sarah discussed, the more you have completed on the phase one, it increases the number of phases that are eligible for funding and also the potential for future cost increases that may occur for the project. John, are you keeping up on where we're at on this?
I can hop in here, Doug, to give you a breather. The next question was, do all project types need to be over 5 million in total cost? For the shared fund, yes, the project cost, again, that's engineering through construction, has to be 5 million or greater, or have 3 sponsors on the project. So if your project isn't 5 million, you would need to have 3 million to qualify for the shared fund. Now for CMAQ, CAP, and CRP, there's no requirement project cost. So you could have a $500,000 project you could apply for, but you could also have a $20 million project you could submit for those other 3 programs. So it does not need to be 5 million in total cost for, again, CMAQ, CAP, or CRP. And then the next one was to confirm is June 2025 when we would hear which projects will be funded. That's the date when it will become official, when it goes in front of the MPO policy committee. Staff will be recommending programs to the project selection committees in April. And there'll be, again, that recommended program will show which project staff is recommending to be funded. And that will lead into public comment period as well before it goes in, before the MPO policy committee in June, as you're mentioning. So there will be opportunities before June to see where the staff recommended program is at, and it will become official in June. Let's see, the next one was the slide mentioned 20 million funding in CRP program. What is the funding level of the CMAQ program? Doug, do you want me to throw it back to you to answer that one?
No, take that one. I got kicked out of Zoom. I'm back. Actually, so for the CMAQ, the roughly annual amount of funding is about 120 million. Now, as I said, 26, 27, 28, there's not 120 million available, but 29 and 2030, there is roughly about 120 million available in those 2 years.
The next one was confirming that planning funds pre-phase 1 engineering are not available in any of these opportunities. That is correct. We will not fund phase 1 engineering unless your community is considered a cohort 4 community and can demonstrate a hardship, and that we will fund phase 1 in those circumstances, but otherwise it's only phase 2 right away construction and construction engineering.
Do you want me to take the next one?
Sure, yeah, I can at least kick it off for you here to confirm if a project has multiple elements such as roadway and bike facilities that may seek funding for different sources such as STP and CMAQ, would one workbook be needed to submit application materials, or would 2 different workbooks need to be identified in the funding source for the separate elements in a project?
So if it's being submitted as one application, then just one workbook. If the different segments or the different elements are being submitted for consideration separately from each other, then you would need to fill out multiple workbooks. But if it's one project application, just one workbook. But please understand, in your costs, detailed costs, it's helpful for staff if you provide a breakdown for those different elements. So the roadway elements versus the bikeway elements, or bike facility elements. That's really helpful so that when we're looking at the project and what potentially could be funded. So for instance, TAP can be funded with it can fund bicycle facility projects, but can't fund a roadway project. And so it could be that TAP funding could be used for the bicycle facility component of the project. Can a project sponsor submit multiple applications? Yes, there is no limit on the number of applications. Though understand that if you're submitting an application, you're committing to move forward if you get selected for the project. So don't submit applications like saying, don't submit 20 applications if you're not able to capable of moving forward with all 20 of those applications. Oh, and Cameron made a note. Also understand that if you are submitting an application with multiple elements and you are seeking funding for a specific element under one category and not under like that, like sort of like the TAP example that I provided, it should have independent utility, meaning that let's say you don't get the road funding, but you get the TAP for the bicycle, like, can you still complete the project without the road funding? So that's another piece to keep in mind. Let's see, do we have any other questions? I don't see any in the chat. Does anybody wish to, you can unmute yourself and ask a verbal question if you like, if that's easier. Just raise your hand and we'll call on you. All right, well, I'm not seeing any other questions. You seeing any hand raise?
I am not.
Okay, well, I'll just take this opportunity to thank you all for joining us. We do look forward to your applications. I will add, a lot of times people have questions on using the ETIP website to submit applications. There is a guide on the Call for Projects website, along with the video giving a demonstration on how to submit an application through the ETIP website. So just highlight that. But if there are no more questions, then there was a question when this webinar will be made available. We'll try to get it up on our website in the next couple of days. So I'll commit by the end of the week, but in most likelihood, we'll have it up today. And with that,
We have one.
just as would a project for EV charging infrastructure for fleets be considered and in a direct emissions reduction project or other project? Yes. EV charging is eligible under the CMAQ and CRP programs and would be considered. Just make sure that it's in most cases it needs to be a public. There are some cases where private EV charging, but typically it's got to have some sort of public component where the general public can access it. Which category, direct emissions or other? So there was another question. EV charging would be under the direct emissions because it's a fueling technology. So it would be under direct emissions for EV charging. All right, last chance if you have a question. I guess we can stay online here for a little bit. I'm going to stop the recording, but thank you all for very much. Staff will stay on the line here in case you're looking to ask some more questions.